It's my pleasure to introduce Dan Yamins, who's a professor of psychology and computer science at Stanford. He has a broad range of interests at the intersection of neuroscience, artificial intelligence, large-scale data analysis. And so his talk today will be about recent advances in brain-inspired self-supervised learning. Please give a warm welcome to Dan.
Great. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. It's good to see such an interesting and engaged audience. So in our lab at Stanford, we work on two mutually reinforcing goals. One is the idea that if you learn more about the brain and cognition, that will help you build better AI, and vice versa. If you have better AI models, you can use those to help understand neural data in some real detail. So in practice, what this means is we build neural networks to solve challenging cognitive problems, and then we use these models to make quantitative predictions about high-throughput brain data, among things. One of the main problems that motivates a lot of our work is visual recognition, visual object recognition. So like as soon as you see a scene like this, you can recognize what's in it fast, effortlessly, accurately, what is where. And the brain solves this really challenging problem with quite a lot of brain mass. In other words, a good fraction of neocortex is devoted to solving this problem in the form of what's called the ventral visual stream. Okay, so this is a series of brain areas that take information like V1, V2, V4, IT, inferior temporal cortex, and if you go up through this hierarchy of brain areas, data is processed such that it can solve those kind of tasks. And you can think of areas like V2 and V4 as intermediate visual features, very similar to those that Sasha was talking about in the last session. Okay? But to think about this model formally, what you might imagine is that information comes in as a kind of population representation, and as it goes through this hierarchy, is re-represented to be able to solve interesting and valuable tasks. So for example, if you look at neurons in the V4 brain area on a categorization performance task, performance is not very good at high variability. However, performance out of neurons in inferior temporal cortex, the next area downstream in that hierarchy, a later layer, is much better, and in fact tracks human performance on the actual task pretty well, right? So this is saying that data is sort of built up through this system and is able to solve really challenging visual recognition tasks. And you can do this for many other tasks besides categorization. Right? So coming into this problem in the past few years, we had been quite interested in making predictive models of single neuron responses throughout that brain system. So as computational neuroscientists, we wanted to use what we could understand about neural networks to do this. And for many years, it sort of was clear what the reasonable model class might be. So convolutional neural networks are one that sort of build in two of the main things that are true about the neuroanatomy of the ventral stream. One is that it's hierarchical, and the other is that it's retinotopic, or spatially tiled, or convolutional, however you want to call it. In fact, CNNs were designed with these things from neuroscience in mind originally. Of course, just knowing that something is a CNN, perhaps, doesn't tell you which specific one it is or what the parameters should be. And there's all these different kinds of architectural or filter parameters of various kinds that you might have to set, and you don't know what the right ones are to think about the brain. So it turns out that there's a lot of possible strategies to solve that, but the most successful is very principled and goal-driven. Namely, if you optimize the system end-to-end to solve a task that the actual system does in the real world, and then compare it against the neural responses in the brain, that actually gives you a pretty good picture of what's happening. So let me tell you a little bit about an example of that. If you optimize a deep neural network, and this work is now many years old at this point, back in 2014, when the types of models built here were deep. If you optimize a neural network to do well on the categorization task, it can say perform nearly as well as the human. That's the red model. The question is, how well does that predict neural data, right? So let's start in the top of this ventral stream in so-called inferior temporal cortex, high-level abstract features. This is what data from a single neuron looks like. This is a neuron that likes faces. Okay, you can see that because it has higher responses for faces than it does for other images. This is not time, it's just images. This is what the neural responses out of the top hidden layer of the neural network predict the neural responses should be. And all of this is on hidden, held out data that hasn't been seen by the network at all prior to making this prediction. Okay, and if you do this not only across this one particular neuron. But across all the neurons that can be recorded in that area, you actually see that models that are substantially better on performance are also the ones that are the best at being like brain, having their top hidden layer look like the brain. In fact, there's a very strong correlation between performance on a kind of object categorization task and the ability to have the neural network be mappable in a detailed way to what the brain is doing in this top hidden layer, in this inferior temporal cortex area at the top of the ventral stream, the most abstract part of it. So if you think about that across the layers, what that will mean is that as you go up through the deep neural network, it's looking at the way in which it maps to, its ability to map to brain areas at the top of the thing, of the ventral stream, goes up, right? So as you go toward the top of the network, it looks more like the actual brain areas that you think are at the top of that area. Now let's actually think about intermediate level features, like the areas that might be carrying the kinds of things we saw earlier in Sasha's talk. Let's say area V4. So here, neural responses are very disordered, right? It's not like there's a neuron that likes faces or something in this area. It's quite complicated what the preferences of the neurons are, and they're just really hard to explain in English. If you look at both the top hidden layer and the earliest layers of a deep neural network, what you see is actually these don't map particularly well at all to the features in the intermediate brain area. Okay? Mapping is bad. But if you look at intermediate layers in the middle, what you find is that the neural network's intermediate layers map quite well to the responses of what's happening in the V4 area of the brain, in that intermediate visual area, right? And that's kind of amazing because not only was the neural network here not optimized to match neural data directly, this layer wasn't even matched solving the task, but it's somehow like the case that this layer is subserving performance downstream, and that by itself is enough to force the features in that layer to look like what the brain has discovered as a good solution for solving visual recognition tasks, right? So if you summarize what I've just told you, it's if you go up through the layers to be like the top part of the ventral pathway, you peak in the middle when you're looking at which layers best predict neural responses in intermediate brain areas such as V4, okay? The same analysis can actually be pushed down to the earliest layers of this network, so like V1 or early visual cortex, and there it turns out that it was sort of clear from inspection that at least in early model deep network models, the filters that arose looked pretty much like what people expected from neuroscience, something like a mixture of Gabor wavelet patches and center surround color opponent units, which are exactly what people see in the brain. And in fact, you can quantify this and see that the early layers of the deep networks are by far the best predictions of the neural responses in early visual cortex, right? So, of course, the things I've shown you in the past couple slides are all old at this point, and they're all kind of shallow and not the best models. Nowadays, to make the best models of a visual system, we have neural networks that are about 12 blocks deep. That's about the number of visual areas in the human visual pathway. And we can make pretty clear, very precise identifications of different parts of the visual system in, different parts of the brain and neuroanatomically with different parts of the system. And I don't expect you to know about posterior or anterior IT, but suffice it to say those are different subregions, and those can actually be mapped pretty precisely into the best task-optimized deep neural network models for visual recognition. Right? And of course, we'd love to be able to make such a thing public with basically every area annotated with the corresponding brain area data, which could be a resource both for neuroscientists and also for people who are looking to learn more about the brain in terms of use for AI. And in fact, putting that on a publicly available brain score is a project that we're also really quite interested in. You could check out the brain score website. But the approach underlying this is to complement a sort of approach from below, that is to say, trying to build up what the feature should look like. That's what in old days people used to do, with this kind of top-down behavioral constraint. And it turns out that if you impose this behavioral constraint on the network, all of the areas kind of fall into place. Okay, kind of perhaps amazingly, maybe there's not that many solutions to this really challenging problem, right? So if you optimize for the task, you get something that looks like the neural data because there's not that many answers, right? So if you sort of think about this in a kind of schematic way, you can formulate a model space, that's the circle with the dots in it, each corresponding to a different model. Different tasks force you down to particular subsets of this space. And if you have a generic learning rule, such as some combination of hyperparameter optimization and like gradient descent, then you can force yourself from whatever initial condition you started down to the subset of models that are good for solving that task. And once you've done that, you can then compare to neural data. And of course, we've done this here in the context of visual recognition with object categorization in the ventral stream. But you might imagine doing that in many different contexts. And in fact, the three ingredients that you would be tweaking to deal with that are, one, the architecture class, so for example, CNNs, two, the task, which is like the loss function and the data set, and three, the learning rule, which is how you get the loss function optimized in that architecture class for your data set. And of course, there's details to be thought of that are really interesting here, like the learning rule itself really has two components, a kind of evolutionary component of hyperparameter search and a developmental learning component of backprop. And all that's very interesting. But what I would just like to leave you with in this part of the talk is that this kind of idea has actually been useful not only in the visual system, but actually in many other areas of the brain as well over the last few years. So for example, in the auditory cortex, of course, you're not optimizing for a visual task. You're optimizing a network to solve an auditory task like speech recognition or music genre recognition or various combinations thereof, environmental sound recognition. And if you do that and compare then to neural data, what you find is that the networks with multiple pathways for different subsets of tasks, but with some shared primary structure, initial processing structure, actually do a very good job of mapping to neural recordings in auditory cortex. And so there's kind of a similar idea here. If you actually look with each dot being a different model, there's still a strong correlation, but now it's between, say, word recognition performance toward the top of the network and the ability of the network throughout to map to different parts of auditory cortex, right? And so this is a similar principle, of course, with a different architecture and task as the visual case. But you might imagine that this applies quite in general across a wide variety of species and modalities, right? So this is nice. There's kind of like a, I don't know, emerging theory of sensory cortex coming out of deep networks here. That's very, I think, really, really attractive idea and quite quantitatively successful, based on pretty simple principles. But it's not all that rosy, right? Of course, on the one hand, we're missing a lot of anatomical structure. For neuroscientists in the audience or people who've looked at all of this, you'll know that there's actually all sorts of recurrence and feedback in neural networks. And those are totally missing from the models that I've shown you, right, in real neural networks, right? So, but why aren't they there? Why don't we need them to explain the data? That's a big problem, okay? Of course, from the point of view of the task, things such as object categorization require a tremendous amount of labeled data, and that's a big problem. And finally, things like this kind of learning rule might really be biologically implausible, right? How do you actually do something like weight transport in the brain? Okay, maybe there are some emerging solutions, but it's a really challenging, big problem, right? So, you know, we've spent some time in our lab sort of, you know, these challenges are kind of like our guiding post. This is what we should be doing next, is solving these. And we've spent some time, we've done some work with convolutional RNNs to make convolutional networks that have strong recurrent structure of various kinds, local recurrences and long-range feedbacks and all the things you would need to actually capture the much richer set of anatomies that you see, and that's an interesting line of work. So maybe that's going in sort of a basically correct direction now. It's not just us that's been working on that, but others as well have had some success. But actually, both this one, the recurrence problem and the learning rule problem, the architecture problem, the learning rule problem, are maybe interesting for neuroscience, right? But they're kind of already solved for machine learning, right? And so I'm not going to talk about these here today. Instead, I'm going to focus on this one, because this one is a really big problem even from an AI perspective. That is, the reliance on extremely large annotated data sets, right? Being able to do away with that would be helpful no matter what, and that's a big open technical problem, okay? So, like, from a cognitive or like, I don't know, animal behavior point of view, it's sort of obvious, right? There's just no way creatures like this receive millions of high-level semantic labels during learning, right? So these tasks might be effective proxies for, like, you know, learning good representations, but they're just deeply wrong as models of what's actually happening. And also, it would be nice to not have to deal with having to collect a lot of expensive annotations, right, just from a pure practical point of view. So it's sort of kind of imperative to find some kind of unsupervised or semi or self-supervised loss function that's realistically costly for the organism to do in the world, but gives powerful representations, right? So there's like been a very proud and long tradition of, you know, unsupervised learning, right? So one of the most like celebrated examples of this is the autoencoder, where you might have nowadays something that you might posit as an hourglass-style network with a penalty of some form in the middle encoding layer. Early version of this was a sparse autoencoder, that is to say, a sort of single layer, and trying to solve the reconstruction problem with a sparseness penalty on the middle. Roughly speaking, led to features that were pretty reminiscent of early visual cortex, like edge detectors came out of this to some extent, right? And that's pretty good, right? That's like a nice success of that unsupervised idea. But it's, in general, been pretty hard to get to work for much deeper networks, or to the extent that you can get it to work, it's been challenging to show that those representations transfer to like high-level object recognition tasks. Maybe because these tasks are in general kind of fighting triviality, right? You have to work really hard to get a really interesting penalty, right? And of course there's, unsupervised solutions to these problems that try to use more sophisticated modern type penalties, and those are certainly better at transferring than previous work using autoencoders. But actually, like the field of unsupervised learning in these representations has moved in a different direction that is really interesting to think about. So one of the beginnings of that different direction was missing data problems. So basically, I give you a piece of data, I project out part of it as an input, I project out the other part as an output, and the job of the network is to learn to reconstruct the missing piece from what you're given, right? And unlike autoencoders, these are clearly non-trivial. So here, one of the nice examples of this is like context prediction. I give you two patches in an image, and you have to tell me how they're related to each other. Right? That turns out to be a pretty good task for self-supervised learning. Another one is impainting, like you take out a piece and then the network has to learn to fill it in. That's also not a bad approach. A really interesting simple one was colorization, meaning like, you start with the black and white image, well, you start with the color image, rip out the color channel, and then you've got to get the network to recolorize the image, right? So it's like autoencoding, but totally non-trivial because it's got to get the colors, right? And these methods have actually done substantially better than simple autoencoders at transferring to like other high-level visual tasks, but they're limited in their own way, in the sense that although like features and intermediate layers can be pretty good, performance transfer to other tasks tends to actually start decreasing as you go up through the layers of the network past a certain point, and they tend to therefore not be able to take advantage of deeper networks to solve the tasks better. So, another solution that's turned out to be very powerful in remedying some of these things comes from a sort of way to generalize some of the ideas over here. This kind of missing data stuff is a little bit ad hoc, right? It's like what things should you project out, and how do you decide what the right one is? And it's kind of hard to sort of automate that process in a meaningful way. So another approach that's kind of gone beyond that comes out of deep embeddings. So this is work that was originally started by Stella Yu, Da-Hua Lin, and some others. And in this work, what the network has to do is instead of solving like a 1,000-way softmax categorization task, you go through the network, but then project it into medium-dimensional embedding space, so compact embedding space, so like a 128-dimensional sphere, unit sphere. And the goal of the loss function in this case is that the embeddings of the image should be close to each other when they're augmentations of the same image, but different images should be pushed far apart. That's roughly what's going on. And it turns out that if you do this kind of, this is like an instance recognition task in a way, right? If you do this instance recognition task, this is actually substantially better than the things that I've shown you so far at transferring to tasks like ImageNet. Somehow a good representation got built this way. And in fact, you can use higher layers and deeper networks, and it is able to take advantage of them, which is really nice. The other approach that actually is sort of related but almost opposite is this something called deep clustering. Okay, so what deep clustering essentially does is take pseudo labels from clusters of network features at the top with random weights, and then cluster them, use those as pseudo labels to train the network, and iterate. Right, so the network is bootstrapping now on the idea not of pushing things apart, like it was in the case of instance recognition, but pushing things together. That's what clustering does, right, essentially. It's natural to combine those ideas. You want to have a network that knows when to push things apart and when to pull them together in embedding. In some ways, that would be the most general thing that you could do with an embedding to solve an unsupervised kind of task-independent learning problem. And that's what we've done with a technique that we call local aggregation. Local aggregation is essentially the idea that if you're in an embedding space, what you want to do is identify two sets of neighbors. So close neighbors, which are determined separately for each example by running a clustering algorithm, and background neighbors, which are determined by just looking at how many unit data points are within a given radius, right, for some fixed size radius. And it turns out that if you optimize a kind of local clustering metric, that is to say, the likelihood of being in a cluster, that is to say, being a close neighbor, given that you are a background neighbor, like if you optimize that, that's going to make things that are close to you things that should be clustered with you, then that turns out to be a really powerful loss function for training something that sort of compromises between learning when to push things together and when to pull them together and push them apart, right? So you basically train the neural network to optimize that kind of local clustering metric in the embedding space. And after training, what happens is that clusters arise of various different sizes, essentially based on what the natural size should be for units around a given point. And it turns out that this is able to produce substantial increases in terms of transfer performance. So like now at the point where ImageNet transfer from these unsupervised networks beats by a significant margin transfer performance from an AlexNet supervised on ImageNet categorization, right? So, you know, that's a kind of arbitrary point to make, but it gives you a sense of a milestone as to where these kinds of much more powerful unsupervised methods have actually started to push. And it turns out that similar networks or the same network can actually achieve really high quality unsupervised results on a bunch of different visual learning tasks. There's related but different work that's being done by others along the sort of line of contrastive predictive coding, and so I urge you to check that out as well. I'm not totally sure how it relates to what I've just told you, but they feel like they should be related, so that's an interesting direction for thinking. But I can say a little bit sort of qualitatively about what these things do. So this is, of course, like correct nearest neighbors, right? So category correct nearest neighbors in ImageNet is on the source image on the left and the examples on the right of things that are nearby. Okay, well, those are pretty obviously similar in some low-level ways. Incorrect examples, though, are also useful, right? In the sense that even if the prediction is wrong, they often have a lot of semantic things in common. And if you try something like this with a less good unsupervised representation, you often see pretty much garbage, right? So you're getting things out of it that are interesting. Of course, you don't know exactly what the semantic structure should be, since this is totally unsupervised, but it provides you things that are related in a useful and interesting way. So I couldn't help doing this since I was here at Pinterest. If you take some images from Pinterest and find the closest neighbors in ImageNet with this algorithm, you get visually correct results. Whether or not this is useful for Pinterest, I can't tell you, but in any case, these types of networks are able to do this in data that they haven't seen in a useful way. Just coming back and sort of closing the loop from a neuroscience perspective for a moment, now that we have networks from a self-supervised perspective that can perform pretty well on tasks that we thought were driving the system to begin with, we can ask how well do the internal layers of these networks predict neurons. And so both in V4 and in IT, a key control or baseline was that all of the previous unsupervised things that we had tried of the kinds that I mentioned do a substantially less good job of predicting neurons, probably in line with the fact that they aren't good enough representations to transfer to other visual tasks. However, it turns out that the kind of networks that I've shown you here, these local aggregation networks, do predict neurons as well as category trained models, actually a little bit better, in fact, and by far the first best self-supervised models to do so. So we're sort of finally being able to build quantitative models of higher brain areas using unsupervised or self-supervised methods. Just to wrap up this part of what I'm going to tell you by mentioning two other recent additional results that are potentially useful from a machine learning point of view. So obviously a real system like a human, it doesn't have no labels. It does get a few labels, right? And you really want to understand what you could do from a semi-supervised learning point of view with the kinds of algorithms that work with and without labels. And it turns out that that can be done pretty well. And of course, you really would like to be working not just in static images, but in videos. And so these types of approaches that I've told you about actually turn out to generalize pretty nicely to both of these. So being able to get close to full supervised results with a tiny fraction of ImageNet labels, and also are able to transfer to all sorts of video tasks in the context of being trained on video, unlabeled video input data. And I can just briefly preview how these things work. So for example, from the context of semi-supervised learning. Recall, this was the type of local aggregation or clustering loss that I mentioned earlier from a unsupervised point of view. To achieve semi-supervised learning, you essentially just add a cross-entropy term between pseudo-labels propagated from the labels that the unsupervised, from the true labels by the unsupervised algorithm, and add that to the loss function. And of course, it actually turns out that it's better if you multiply by the confidence of the pseudo-labels. But if you do this, this is actually turns out to be quite a powerful, very simple semi-supervised learning technique. You know, as I say, achieve like high quality results on a wide scale range of these tasks, and especially effective in a very low data regime. From a video perspective, it turns out that if you essentially run a kind of embedding procedure on subsets of frames of the video, sampled in careful ways, then the representation created thereby is actually a really good embedding of a video. And the sampling procedure is what's at stake here. It's like, how do you know what time scales you should be taking videos and how to order the frames, and indeed do the temporal order of the frames matter? And they do if you do it carefully with the right kind of combination of static and dynamic streams in the processing architecture. And that turns out to produce good results from a video learning point of view. So I'll sort of suggest in this, kind of wrapping up this part of what I'm saying, that like, you know, this problem may start to be going towards okay. Certainly, these tasks are not perfectly solved. I mean, supervision is still better and may be necessary for a while, but I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years, these kind of self-supervised methods were actually really useful in like the real world, at least insofar as any of these things with deep learning have been affecting the real world, which of course they, to some extent, have been. But like, in the last part of my talk, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. Okay, you can think of what I'm saying, what I've said so far as kind of very classical. It's kind of like modern classical unsupervised learning with deep networks, right? There's offline data generation, and like, you know, this is like randomized data, there's no interaction going on here, this is all pretty classical. But it seems that if you're really interested in self-supervision, then active learning in the context of a real agent is a much more rich way to go about this, right? And so everything I've said may be helpful, but it really should be either complemented or supplanted eventually by active learning in a real context. And so, like, what would that entail? Well, first of all, dynamics in a scene should give a richer signal than static information as a general rule. Like, so an obvious way to think about this is that you would have a temporal autoencoder rather than, you know, a static autoencoder, like I said before. But pixel prediction, this is essentially pixel prediction, right, is really hard, right? So if you take like a modern state-of-the-art pixel predictor and you try it in this very thumb case of where there's this like a synthetic room with two objects in it and an agent acting on that, such that the truth of what should happen as the agent moves its camera, its head, and acts on the objects is this. Best predictions out of the things that we can find are kind of like this. So it gets the background, but it totally misses the objects, right? And that's not for an arbitrary reason. And I'll talk about how that is in a paper that underlies some thinking about that we've been working on. Look, humans, and this is where cognition can be really helpful, humans are extremely good at certain forms of manipulation of data in the world. And in particular, they're really good at object permanence. The idea that if you see something, like when it goes behind something, it doesn't disappear, right? So like people working in cognitive science have really shown that like young infants understand what's happening in displays where there's like objects and then the object as a occluder is taken away, and if they see this, they're not surprised. But if they see a stick with two parts randomly hanging, they're gonna be really surprised. They know something is wrong, right? So fundamentally, there's a problem, which is that like conv2D structures, spatially uniform conv2D structures, just have terrible trouble learning that concept, right? Even if you put all sorts of like state memory structures locally in the system, various forms of RNNs, either like internal or external memory stores. And like the problems are like the object blows up or it disappears or it leaks, or it's just really hard to actually get it to do this, right? And it's sort of structurally clear why that kind of might be. In a way that if you had a conv3D structure, that won't be so true, okay? Of course, like they're really inefficient, and there's going to be problems with using conv3D. In fact, the idea that you'd use conv3D to do the kind of detailed understanding of objects in the world that I can do at high resolution that humans can do is just dexterous manipulation. It's just impossible to imagine, right? So There's an alternative solution that I think is very attractive, which is to use graph-based priors. So in particular, instead of spatially uniform structures like a convnet, a convolutional graph structure turns out to be a really good structure to use here as well. And relational networks were an early version of this that tried to do this and show that you can do prediction in very simplified tasks, like these bouncing 2D balls. But actually, real humans are like exposed to, real robots and humans are exposed to much more complicated systems, scenes, and you really need a system that can handle this kind of level of complexity. Right? And we certainly do if we want to use this to make models of neurons, right? So an interesting idea is to describe objects or even complex scenes through graph particleizations or graph partifications of the scene, right? So you can do that for not only single complex objects, but also complex scenes. And you're thinking of the graph now as one where the nodes correspond to particles or subparts, and edges correspond to relationships between those particles. Of course, humans don't think about all the particles at the lowest level at the same time, right? So you really want to be working with a hierarchical version of this, where you can think of each node and intermediate layers being a part, right? And that means that instead of working with graph convolution, you're going to be working with hierarchical graph convolution. And, leaving the details aside, it turns out that if you build a kind of hierarchical graph convolution unit and use that to learn a network end-to-end that predicts dynamics in a scene, you can actually do a pretty good job for a wide variety of types of shapes and materials. So, like, this is a deformable cone bouncing off a floor, or this is the rigid Stanford bunny bouncing off a flat plane. At the top is ground truth and the bottom is the prediction, or deformable box bouncing off an incline, or multiple rigid objects colliding. Of course, the ground truth is different from the prediction, but the ground truth and the prediction are both plausible, right? Humans wouldn't know that one of them was wrong or then one of them was right. Or a more complicated scene like a rigid sphere rolling out of a bowl, or a more complicated non-rigid scene such as a floppy teddy bear bouncing off the floor and recovering. All these kinds of things can be predicted pretty well. Stable towers or unstable towers getting knocked down, or cloth folding. Of course, all these material types basically are represented as edge labels in this kind of hierarchical scene graph that I've described. Of course, what I haven't described and don't fully understand how to do is how to extract that representation from the scene from video, right? So that's an obviously outstanding, really important challenge. And we're working on versions of how to do this that try to intercalate hierarchical graph extraction interspersed with the hierarchical spatially uniform features in the convnet that process images so well. The initial results are okay, and suggest that further development is going to be both successful but also definitely needed. But it would really ultimately be good to be able to get this out of video in a generic way, and so that's a really important problem. But even if you solve this problem, something is missing, right? Like, actual video scenes, like in the world, with no action from the agent are pretty boring, right? Most of the time, nothing is happening. And so this, typically, if you do this on like standard video, will like converge to a trivial thing because actually nothing is changing. But real infants are like obviously producing non-trivial video signals all the time for themselves, right? If you look at what an infant does over time, they like construct really interesting data streams. And presumably are learning a lot from those data streams, right? Okay, if we want to make a model of something like that, we got to move to something that's more interactive, right? So instead of like just video, you've got to be in an environment, right? And you have to have an agent, and your loss function might be something like action conditional future prediction, right? That's a natural idea. You want to do action conditional future prediction. Okay, great. But this doesn't work, and it trivializes for a very obvious reason. If you give the agent volitional control over what it'll do and it's trying to minimize this formula, it will stare at the floor, because that minimizes that term, right? Okay, the agent's going to be lazy, because it's incentivized to be lazy, right? So you really need to have an additional term in this loss function for such a scheme to work. You've got to have an intrinsic motivation that forces the agent to do something non-trivial, right? Let's now think about a more formalized model of the perception action loop, where you receive stuff in and you take actions out. And in particular, I want to distinguish two types of substructures within the model, the agent's brain, okay? One of them is the world model, which tries to learn to do action conditional future prediction. And the other is a self model, which learns to predict some things about the agent. Whatever it is, some internal reflection of your own capacities or something, and the different things can be slotted in there. On top of that idea, it's very natural to put in one or another form of curiosity, right? And there's many different forms. But in general, what they're sort of trying to do is direct the agent to take actions that the world model doesn't yet fully understand, right? So that is to say, if you know what's going to be hard and interesting for the world model via curiosity, the world model will learn better, which will then in turn support more informed curiosity, which should lead to a virtuous cycle of learning, right? That's the underlying active learning hypothesis in this kind of context. And so we've been doing some work to try to push that a little bit forward. Others have certainly been working nicely on it as well. But in the context we're interested, it was really in this visual learning development. And so in the model that I'm going to show you, there's an environment where there's a baby that can swivel its head, move around the room and apply forces to objects if it's close enough to those objects, and receive images back of what's happening given its action, right? So, of course, we implement the different world model and self-model parts with neural networks. What else would we do? So the world model is a neural network that's being used to learn the action conditional future prediction problem, and the self-model is, in this case, being learned to learn the error surface of the world model. That is to say, predict how hard a given action will be to predict for the world model. Right? So the goal of the world model is to do that problem, and the goal of the self-model is to predict the errors of the world model, right? And then a very simple implementation of, quote, curiosity is adversarial curiosity. That is to say, choose actions that maximize the world loss model. You could actually do many other things too, and I'll briefly mention those toward the end. But this is the very simplest thing that you can do, make the self-model adversarial to the world model. Okay, so now let's set that system like in a room. Okay, what will it do? Well, okay, it's got it in a room with a single object. It turns out that if you do this, either the curious policy or the random policy, both of them, first seem to focus on ego motion learning alone, meaning they're like learning the consequences of moving your head. And loss in the prediction problem goes down accordingly, and both models learn to solve both the curious policy and the baseline control of random will learn to solve this sort of easy ego motion solving task. Okay? But only the curious one will move on to the next stage. And in this next stage, what reliably happens at a certain point is that by virtue of getting bored with solving the ego motion problem, the curious agent realizes that it's actually much harder and therefore more interesting to spend time when there's an object in front of you, because predicting what happens when you're touching an object, the consequences of your action is much harder, right? So as a result, the agent ends up discovering that it's a good idea to spend time allocating your attention to looking at an object, and by virtue of doing that, gets much better, that's the blue line at the bottom, compared to, say, alternative policies, at predicting the actual world model with when they're in the hard case, that is to say, when there are object interactions going on. And those things transfer to a variety of things. So for example, very simple navigation and planning behavior will emerge. If the object is not in view, the agent will look for it, turn around. That's what these maps are kind of like the action space maps, heat maps of what the agent wants to do. If the object is not in view, we'll turn around and find it. If it's far away, we'll go toward it. And once it's there, it will stay there and interact with it until it learns more. Right? And by doing this, actually learns not only to solve the world model prediction problem, but the features themselves transfer to visual recognition tasks like object detection or position localization or shape recognition. Substantially better than they do under the random policy by very large margins. And in particular, you can actually get much more interesting effects with more interesting environments. So if you put that same agent now in an environment with two objects, it'll first recapitulate all of the things that it saw with one object, but then at some point it will start to get bored with playing with one object and realize that making two objects interact is much, much more interesting. Okay? So as a result, two-object play frequency increases, and perhaps most importantly, the transfer capacity of the system trained that way to actually solve an object recognition problem goes up a lot, especially large gain compared to the single object case, right? So the features, by virtue of learning, like what the shapes have to be able to predict the interaction, are really much more useful for visual transfer. More recently, we've been trying to combine some of the things that I've told you here, so like a combination of both the curiosity idea and also the underlying graph physics dynamic model to be able to do the things that I just told you, but in a much more real-world, sophisticated setting. I don't have time to show those results, but I'll just say that models trained this way actually generalize substantially better to real data than those trained on handcrafted data sets. So that's a very powerful kind of way of combining these things. And finally, we're also really interested in applying this kind of modeling techniques in the context of multi-agent systems, where you're interested in looking how social behavior arises as a function of intrinsic motivation as well, with the idea to understand basically why humans spend so much time interested in animate objects, like people, and less interested in other things like random motion, for example. And that turns out to both be a good driver of other curiosity signals and require things besides adversarial training. So that's really interesting. In any case, I'll just summarize by saying two things. One is classical self-supervision has come a long way. So unsupervised learning is really reaching some of its potential and maybe the starting point for quantitative theories of visual development and also real use in the world. And active learning-based methods melding intrinsic motivation and like high-quality world modeling provide a complementary and hopefully fuller picture eventually with a human-centric loop as part of what we do to try to figure these things out. Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. So if anybody has questions, please go to the mic.
I wanted to ask about a method that 5 years ago the entire machine learning community got excited about, Boltzmann machines. They seem to have have potential to solve the categories that you listed, especially the Hebbian rule of learning and unsupervised learning.
Sorry, so but what's the question?
The question is, what's your opinion about potential of Boltzmann machines to kind of better represent how brain works?
I think it's an interesting hypothesis. There have been attempts to try it, and performance out of the networks trained that way is not good enough to be in the game. So it's like the hypothesis hasn't cut it yet, but that doesn't mean the general idea is wrong.
Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit more on why we have feedback and lateral connections?
The short answer is I don't know. There's two major categories of hypotheses that make sense. One of them is the feedback and lateral connections allow you to do some online inference task better, like categorization or something. Like, I don't know, hard occluded examples or something are better when you have those structures. And the evidence for that is fairly thin on the ground, I think, at this point. Like, we can train these recurrent convolutional networks with all the kind of right bells and whistles. We can get them to do like a bit better on categorization tasks than an equivalently deep feed-forward network. So you do gain something. You can like double the performance of a ResNet 18, but with convolutional baubles and feedbacks. Recurrent baubles and feedbacks can go up to like the performance of a ResNet 34 or something like that. That's the kind of result that we've attained and is not that different from what I think others have obtained. I think it's minor improvements, and is it really what's driving this like incredible wealth of recurrent and feedback connections? I'm a little skeptical, I'm not sure. Maybe we just haven't done it right yet, or it's not the right task or something, right? It might not be categorization, maybe it's some segmentation or something, I don't know. The other hypothesis is that the recurrence and feedback are not actually that useful for online inference, but instead they're implementing the learning, right? If you were gonna actually implement backprop in the brain, there's gonna be feedbacks, right? But however it's actually done, or some version, some approximation of it is done, it's gonna have a circuit with a recurrence in it. Maybe that's what that stuff is. And so like the prediction of that hypothesis would be, you are a neuroscientist, you turn off the recurrence during online inference, it doesn't actually change performance that much. But if you turn it off during learning, everything goes haywire. Which one of those is it really? I don't know, but it would be nice to know. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we don't have time for another question. So let's thank the speaker again for an excellent talk. Thank you.